I thought leaving her was the hardest part. The breakup with Clara had been an emotional amputation, necessary but agonizing. She was never just a difficult girlfriend. She was an atmosphere, obsessive, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifyingly insightful. She'd known about meetings I hadn't told anyone about, and once she'd described a childhood nightmare of mine in perfect detail, a nightmare I'd never shared. I dismissed it all as intense intuition, a side effect of her controlling nature. When I moved into my new apartment in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, it felt like an exhale. White walls, empty closets, and, most importantly, space, the blessed absence of Clara. I changed my number, deleted her from social media, and made a promise to myself, a clean slate. The clean slate lasted exactly 2 weeks. It started with the phone calls. My phone would vibrate showing, "private number." I'd answer, expecting a telemarketer or a wrongly dialed friend, but there was never the heavy breathing of a typical creep. Instead, there was a vast, cold silence, broken only by a faint, dragging whisper that sounded like static and wind chimes at the same time. It was unintelligible except for one thing. My name. Liam. Liam. It would sigh, slow and distorted, before the line clicked dead. I'd turn on every light in the apartment, assuring myself it was just a burner phone or a final, pathetic act of stalking. But the next incident was harder to rationalize. I was watching a movie late one Tuesday night when my smart TV abruptly cut to black. Then, the screen flickered back to life, ignoring the remote. It wasn't a channel, it was a video file. One of the goofy little montages Clara and I had made of our happiest moments. Quick clips from road trips and dinners. But the video was warped, slow, and the music was a low, guttural moan. In the middle of one clip, Clara's face filled the screen. She wasn't smiling at the camera like she was supposed to. She was staring directly into my apartment, into my eyes, with an expression that was calm, knowing, and deeply malignant. The corner of her mouth lifted in a smirk so subtle I almost missed it. It was as if she was watching me watch her, utterly certain of this moment's arrival. I ripped the power cord from the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The final straw of that week was the lipstick. I came home from work to find the familiar, sticky, cherry red smear across the white paint of my front door. It wasn't just a threat this time, it was a brand, "You're mine forever. You're mine." Then came the night I knew, with chilling certainty, that this wasn't just a person. I was trying to sleep when I heard it. A soft, distinct thud, thud, thud coming from the kitchen. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and crept out, adrenaline flooding my system. The kitchen was empty, the back door was locked, the window was shut. Every shadow was exactly where it should be. My eyes scanned the countertop, searching for a dropped utensil or a dislodged dish. That's when I saw it. My phone, which I had left charging on the bedside table, was lying right in the center of the kitchen counter. The screen was still lit, displaying the photo gallery. I picked it up, my hand shaking too badly to hold the bat. A new image had been taken exactly 3 minutes prior. It was a picture of me. I was sound asleep in my bed. The angle was close, low, as if the person holding the phone was leaning over me. But what made the blood drain from my face wasn't the violation. It was the lighting. The flash hadn't gone off. The picture was taken in the dark, yet the camera had perfectly captured the details of my face, illuminated by a faint, sickly white light that seemed to emanate from just outside the frame. I was no longer just dealing with a stalker. I was dealing with a presence that could slip past locks and darkness, an entity that had just stood inches from my sleeping face. The game had begun and I was losing before I even knew the rules. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with the baseball bat staring at the kitchen counter where my phone had been, trying to reconcile the impossible. A stalker who could phase through walls, a human being who moved without a sound and took photos in pitch darkness. It was absurd, but the fear was concrete, icy, and real. The next day, I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove over to the old neighborhood, the one I had shared with Clara. My goal was simple, find her new place, confirm she was still alive, and finally get the police involved. But as I sat parked a block from her last known address, staring at the anonymous brick building, a terrifying thought struck me. Why hadn't she demanded money or begged me to come back? The messages were about ownership. You're mine forever. I pulled out my phone, ignoring the fresh wave of anxiety the device gave me, and did a quick search. I typed in her name, Clara Vinson. I expected to find a recent social media post or maybe an old workplace profile. What I found instead was a small, grainy obituary from a local paper dated 2 weeks after our breakup. My hands began to shake violently, and I nearly dropped the phone. The headline read, "Local woman killed in single car accident on Route 10." The picture was hers, Clara, smiling her usual wide, slightly manic smile. The date of death was exactly 14 days after I had moved out. I couldn't breathe. My throat closed up, and the world outside the car dissolved into a dull roar. Clara was dead. She had been dead this whole time. The calls, the lipstick, the TV, the picture taken of me sleeping. It wasn't the end of a bad relationship. It was the start of a haunting. But not a ghost story. This felt different, darker. This realization fractured my reality. My friends, of course, thought I was cracking up. "You're paranoid, man," Jake had said over the phone. "You probably just never heard the news, or maybe it's a sick twin sister." I hung up on him. There was no twin. Driven by a desperate need to understand what had claimed her and was now claiming me, I went to her parents' house saying I was clearing out some of her forgotten things. They were grieving and confused, but they let me into her childhood bedroom, which was now a shrine. Hidden beneath her old college notebooks, I found it. A small leather-bound journal with a clasp. Inside, the pages were not filled with typical teenage diaries. They were covered in meticulous angular handwriting and filled with intricate drawings. Not of flowers or boys, but of strange, recursive symbols and unsettling geometric patterns. Phrases were repeated again and again in a language that looked like distorted Latin. Eternus vinculum, followed by my name, Liam. There were entries discussing the binding, a ritual meant to permanently link two souls, bypassing the frailties of human emotion and even death. It wasn't about love. It was about possession. I realized with a sickening twist that her controlling nature hadn't been a personality flaw. It was a dark, calculated necessity for this ritual. I fled the house, clutching the journal. I drove straight back to my apartment, the symbols etched in my mind. I was no longer a free man. I was tethered to something that had simply changed its form, shedding its human skin to keep its hold on me. I stumbled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to scrub away the horror. I looked up at the mirror. For a full, agonizing second, everything was normal. Just me, Liam, terrified and soaked. Then, as I moved to wipe the water from my eyes, my reflection didn't move. It smiled. My reflection's eyes were not my own. They were a deep, tarry black, and resting on my shoulder, just out of my actual line of sight, was a hand. It was pale and too long, with fingers tipped in sharp, brittle nails. A wave of ice-cold pressure settled on me. But the worst thing was the face in the glass. It wasn't Clara's face. It was the distorted, skeletal parody of a face with her features stretched and pulled into an inhuman mask of pure malice. And the reflection whispered, the same sound from the phone call, only now it was deafening in my head. "You can never leave." The reflection faded, replaced by my own panicked image. But the crushing weight on my shoulder remained. The mirror had confirmed the journal. I hadn't just broken up with a woman. I had unknowingly fallen in love with something that never intended to let my soul go. The leather-bound journal became my new Bible, and the apartment became my cage. I spent the next 48 hours submerged in Clara's insane scriptures. Every flickering light, every phantom whisper of my name, reminded me that the binding was tightening. The entity, whatever wore Clara's face in the mirror, was here to claim my soul, not just haunt my house. The symbols in the journal were complex, referencing archaic occult practices and a chilling concept. The soul, or animus, could be treated as a physical possession. Her entries detailed the process of establishing the link, but the final, most crucial page, the one that would detail the severing ritual, was missing. It hadn't been torn out. It looked as though it had simply dissolved, leaving only faint, burnt orange residue on the page margins. I went online, desperately searching the deepest corners of the web for anything that matched Clara's strange drawings. I finally found a thread on a dark web forum that discussed symbiotic hauntings and, buried in a centuries-old text, a mention of the central symbol in Clara's journal, the Eye of the Bound. It was a sigil representing eternal forced devotion, but the text provided a lifeline. The binding was not indestructible. It was tied to the vessel of the first contact, the object Clara used to initiate the link. I racked my brain. When did the obsession start? When did she first know things she shouldn't have? It was about a year into our relationship, right after she'd given me a seemingly innocuous gift for my birthday, a heavy silver keyring shaped like a serpent coiled around a single polished black stone. I'd never taken it off my house keys since. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The serpent keyring wasn't a gift. It was the anchor. That night, the attacks escalated from psychological dread to outright violence. The lights in my apartment shattered, casting the living room into pitch blackness. A bone-chilling cold swept through the air, and a deep, guttural laugh echoed from the hallway. I didn't run. I couldn't. I sprinted to the kitchen counter where I always kept my keys. As I fumbled for them, a tall, distorted figure materialized in the doorway, blocking my escape. It was the shadow from the mirror, towering, thin, and impossibly black. But now 2 points of light glowed where its eyes should be, the exact red of the lipstick on my door. "You're mine, Liam," the voice scraped, no longer a whisper, but a harsh, echoing roar that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. Forever is a long time. I ignored the crippling terror. My fingers closed around the cold, coiled serpent on the keyring. As the entity lunged, its skeletal arm reaching out to clamp down on my chest, I focused every ounce of my remaining will on the serpent. With a desperate cry, I brought the keyring down onto the corner of the kitchen counter. The silver bent slightly, but the polished black stone held firm. The entity roared, a sound of agony and rage that shook the walls. It was momentarily stunned, its shadow flickering. I slammed the keyring down again and again, aiming for the stone. The metal screamed, and on the third strike, the black stone cracked. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The shadowy entity shrieked, a deafening, inhuman sound, and recoiled as if struck by lightning. The blackness that defined it began to tear, revealing not Clara's face but a void of sickly, swirling light. It was screaming, pulling at its own dissolving form. With the last of my strength, I brought the bat down not on the shadow, but directly onto the keyring, smashing the already cracked stone into dust. The moment the stone disintegrated, the crushing weight on my soul lifted. The black shadow vanished, the cold air rushed out, and the lights in the room popped back on, leaving me alone, gasping on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and silence. I survived. I had broken the binding. But the silence didn't last. 2 weeks later, I was cleaning up the remnants of my destroyed life, finally daring to look at myself in the bathroom mirror again. My reflection looked back, pale, scarred, but whole. I smiled, a genuine relieved smile. But my reflection didn't quite match. The smile was too slow, too wide. And then the voice, the familiar cold whisper, no longer in my head but in the air, breathed a single word, full of dark amusement. "Hello?" My reflection's smile faded and the corners of its mouth began to droop, pulling into a familiar, terrifying, manic smirk. The eyes that stared back at me were definitely mine, but the animus behind them was no longer Liam. I had destroyed the anchor, but the entity had found a new, more permanent vessel, Me. I hadn't broken the binding. I had simply forced the transfer. And now, the thing that loved me forever had a brand new life. The new apartment high up in a modern Chicago tower was supposed to be my sanctuary. White walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the constant reassuring sound of city traffic, all miles away from the mess that was Rena. Our breakup months ago hadn't been a clean cut. It was a tearing. She was volatile, passionate, and often frighteningly intense. I'd always told myself it was just extreme emotion. Then, she vanished. Her car was found submerged in a river outside the city limits. The news reports were ambiguous, presumed dead, but no body recovered. It was a tragic, unresolved end that should have brought me closure, but instead, it left a gaping, ugly hole in my memory. I tried to forget her, but how do you forget a ghost that might not even be a ghost? For the first few weeks in the new place, the silence was perfect. But then, the phone calls started. It would be after midnight. My phone would buzz, and on the screen, clear as day, was the name I had deleted everywhere, Rena. I always answered. I couldn't help myself. I kept expecting a prank, a blackmailed friend, a sick joke. But when I said hello, there was no voice, no static, no breathing. Just the awful, unmistakable sound of water. It was a heavy, liquid sound, as if someone had submerged the microphone, punctuated by sudden, muffled bursts, like air escaping from a throat, or a desperate struggle to draw a breath. I would listen, paralyzed, until the line cut out with a chilling, gurgling click. The terror intensified when I started finding things in the apartment. I live alone, completely alone. Yet twice that week I found a small clump of dark, wet hair on the sparkling white tile of my bathroom floor. It was long, unmistakably Rena's color, and always damp, no matter how dry the air in the room was. Then came the sounds. I'd be watching TV and hear a faint sloshing, scraping noise coming from inside the walls near the bathroom. It sounded exactly like something heavy and wet shifting inside the drywall, or maybe like water sloshing against a loose panel. I'd tap the wall, solid, but the sound always stopped when I listened closely, only to resume the moment I turned my attention away. My friends dismissed it. "It's the new building settling, Mark. You're stressed about Rena's disappearance. It's paranoia." But paranoia doesn't leave reddish-brown fingerprint smudges on the clear plastic wrapping of the chicken I kept in the freezer, as if someone with cold, wet hands had struggled to open it. The most terrifying moment arrived one humid Tuesday night. I was standing at the bathroom sink, splashing water on my face after one of the phantom calls, when I looked up into the mirror. My reflection stared back, pale and exhausted. But just over my shoulder, standing inches behind me, was a shadow. It was tall, too dark for the bathroom light, and subtly moving. As I slowly, agonizingly turned my head to confirm the impossible, my reflection became clearer. The shadow wasn't a shadow. It was Rena. She was wearing the damp, dark dress she'd worn on our last date. Her face was gaunt, her hair plastered to her cheeks, and she was absolutely soaking wet. Her eyes were wide, vacant, and fixed on the back of my head. I froze, unable to scream, unable to move. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a projection, a reality warping itself around me. Then my phone, which was charging on the counter, buzzed. A new incoming call. Rena. In the mirror, the figure of Rena in the reflection slowly lifted her pale, dripping hand. She picked up my phone, and her gaunt, wet face twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't reach her dead eyes. She had confirmed it. The calls were real. The haunting was real. And whatever had happened to Rena, it meant she wasn't just dead. She was actively hunting for me, and she had just proved her power to reach beyond the glass. After the mirror incident, sleep became impossible. I disconnected the Wi-Fi, unplugged the TV, and wrapped my phone in a towel before locking it in a kitchen drawer. I couldn't stop the calls, but I could stop seeing the name Rena flash on the screen. The reality was undeniable. The woman who had died 2 months ago was actively trying to reach me, or something wearing her dread was. I became obsessed with the call logs. I checked my provider records, convinced I could find a clue. That's when I noticed the final terrifying inconsistency. The day Rena disappeared, the day her car plunged into the river, she had called me. My phone records showed a 2-minute inbound call from her number, but when I checked my phone's actual call history from that day, the log was empty. It was a ghost call, a connection that existed only in the network data, not on my device. It suggested not just a haunting, but some kind of supernatural void surrounding her disappearance. This drove me to her past. I broke into her old apartment building and retrieved the emergency key to her storage unit, a desperate criminal act fueled by pure terror. Inside, amongst dusty boxes, I found her old laptop. I powered it up, praying for a password guess, and surprisingly, it booted right into her desktop. I spent hours trawling through her encrypted files until I found a folder marked Future. It held a series of draft emails, none of which had ever been sent. They were rambling, almost delusional. But one passage made the hair on my arm stand up. "The water will take me, but the water will not keep me," he promised. "If I disappear, he will return me, and then I will find you, Mark. You will never be free of me, not even in death." Who was he? Some kind of pact or entity linked to her instability. The idea of a pre-planned occult disappearance, a deal made with the dark, was far more terrifying than a mere vengeful ghost. But the fear soon expanded beyond my apartment walls. I started noticing things outside. Walking to the grocery store, I saw people on the street corners, just normal people, but they would stop and stare at me with a vacant, searching look for a few unnerving seconds before moving on, as if they were looking through me, searching for something else. The news started to confirm my growing dread. The local papers reported an unusual spike in unexplained drownings, people found dead in bathtubs or flooded basements miles from the river. The police were baffled, ruling them accidents. I pulled up the articles on my secure laptop. I zoomed in on the details. One victim, a woman in her 60s, was found with a faded reddish mark, a damp, smudged handprint, on her kitchen counter. Another victim's final activity was a bizarre, untraceable incoming call logged on their work phone just minutes before death. Rena wasn't just haunting me. She was leaking into the city. Her influence was a tide of dark, watery retribution, and every death felt like a preparation, a clearing of the path. She wasn't ready to strike me yet. She was consolidating her power, marking her territory, making the entire urban landscape feel like the bottom of a cold, black lake. The ultimate horror wasn't being targeted, but realizing I was the anchor. I was the thing she was bound to, and everything she did to the city was merely a byproduct of her monstrous effort to finally reach me. One night, the apartment walls thrummed with the sound of running water, louder than ever. I looked out the window at the vibrant, sleepless city lights, and for the first time, I didn't see Chicago. I saw a massive, sprawling hunting ground, and I knew, deep down, that when the city had been sufficiently softened by fear and death, I would be next. I wasn't fighting a ghost. I was watching an entire city fall to a watery, ancient promise Rena had made to claim my soul. The city was choking. The inexplicable drownings, now dubbed the water deaths by a terrified, whispering public, had stopped being news and started being a pattern. They were a ritualistic preparation, and I was the final sacrifice. Rena wasn't a ghost tied to a spot. She was a spiritual predator who had made a pact, and the entire urban environment was just her hunting blind. I knew I couldn't fight the entity. The power that could twist water and command death across a metropolitan area was not something I could defeat with a baseball bat. My only chance was to break the connection, to sever the anchor that kept her essence focused on me, or simply to outrun the tide. I spent my final days in that apartment destroying everything Rena had ever given me, everything we had shared, photos, letters, even a small dried flower she'd pressed. I burned them in the sink, watching the ashes turn to damp sludge. But the calls didn't stop. They came every 5 minutes now, the sound of gurgling water overwhelming the silence. The final night began with the smell of river mud. It hit me the moment I walked in the door, a heavy, earthy, metallic stench that overpowered the manufactured scent of the building's air conditioning. The temperature dropped instantly, making my breath fog in the air. I checked the windows. They were sealed tight. Yet, from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, the sound of rushing, turbulent water had become deafening. It wasn't the sound of a leak. It was the sound of being submerged. I felt the cold seeping into the carpet, making the fibers slick beneath my shoes. Then the lights went out, plunging the apartment into the suffocating darkness of a deep trench. In the living room, the darkness shifted. The air grew thick like breathing soup. I saw her, not as a reflection or a shadow, but as a dense, shimmering outline of water itself. She stood tall, her dress dripping ceaselessly, her face a mask of furious, agonizing hunger. She didn't move quickly. She didn't need to. Her very presence was the attack. As she slowly advanced, the pressure built in my head and my lungs constricted. I felt the overwhelming, primal urge to simply give up and inhale the water that wasn't there. This was the binding, the control, the surrender. "You belong to me, Mark," the voice echoed, a wet, drawn-out groan that scraped across my mind. "You cannot leave him." I stumbled backward, not from fear, but from a sudden, desperate surge of rage, not at her, but at the helplessness. Rena had always thrived on my surrender. In life, she demanded obedience. In death, she demanded my soul. And in that moment of absolute clarity, I realized the binding wasn't just on me, it was on her. She couldn't take me until I fully yielded. "You made the deal," I screamed, my voice thin and cracking against the roar of the phantom water. "You're the prisoner. You made a bargain just to keep me." The watery form of Rena paused. Her head tilted, the movement unnaturally slow. I had hit the truth, the core of her monstrous obsession. She was bound to the pact, a desperate, flawed tool of some greater power. I turned and ran. I didn't look back at the shimmering figure or the clawing darkness. I sprinted toward the front door, tearing it open, and scrambling out into the brightly lit, sterile hallway of the apartment building. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the suffocating cold snapped away. I didn't stop to grab my wallet or my keys. I ran down the emergency stairwell, the frantic pounding of my feet a stark contrast to the silence that had replaced the torrent of water. I ran out of the building, got in my car, and drove. I drove straight out of Chicago, away from the river, away from the city that had been poisoned by her grief. I didn't stop until I was 3 states away on the quiet coast of Oregon, miles from any major body of fresh water. Life is quiet now. I live in a small town. The phone calls have stopped. The reddish prints are gone. I tell myself I was right, that my defiance had momentarily short-circuited the binding, and the simple physical act of putting hundreds of miles between us was enough to break the immediate connection. But sometimes, when I stand near the Pacific coastline, the heavy metallic smell of river mud hangs faintly in the air. And every time it rains, I instinctively reach for the lock on my door. Just yesterday, while sitting alone in my small cottage, the screen of my laptop suddenly awoke, glowing with the familiar chilling blue light. No video played, no message appeared. Just the idle screen. Then from the speakers, faint as a raindrop hitting glass, came a single drawn-out gurgle. I survived. But I know that the city wasn't her target. It was her path. And now that I have run, I only have to wait for the tide to find a new shore. The struggle isn't over. It has merely moved to the quiet places. The new apartment in the city was my clean slate, bathed in the cool light of possibility. After the breakup with Sarah, a woman whose passion was always inseparable from her need to control, I'd felt drained and diminished. Then, she simply vanished. No note, no goodbye, just gone from the city. The relief was immense, almost indecent. I had 6 months of pure, untethered peace, late nights working, early mornings running, and the glorious freedom of making my own choices. I figured I was safe. People don't just return from thin air. Then I met Lisa. It was at a mutual friend's gallery opening in Chelsea. Lisa stood across the room talking to the artist. She was stunning, elegant, composed, with a quiet confidence that immediately drew me in. Her hair was a different shade of blonde than Sarah's, her style far more refined, almost minimalist. When our eyes met, she offered a genuine, gentle smile. There was an undeniable familiarity to her face, a fleeting recognition that I chalked up to wishful thinking or maybe a common look in this city. We spoke for hours. She was witty, engaging, and seemed to understand my cynical humor perfectly. She told me she was new to the city, a designer looking for fresh inspiration. When she gave me her number, I felt a familiar, exhilarating pull, but this time, it felt safe. Within 2 weeks, Lisa was a fixture in my life. Everything felt easy, the opposite of the exhausting drama I'd endured before. But the ease was deceptive. It started with little things, tiny inconsistencies that pricked at the back of my mind. One evening, we were debating where to eat. I was listing off places when she cut me off, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We're not going to that terrible Thai place on 28th Street, Mark. You always hate the way they overcook the noodles." I paused, setting down my keys. "I've never taken you there, Lisa. And actually, that was my biggest complaint about that place." "How did you know?" She laughed it off, a perfect melodic sound. "I must have heard you complain about it to Sam or something. You're such a creature of habit, Mark." She was right about the habit, but the way she said it, so certain, so intimate, made the hairs on my neck rise. Sarah used to talk about my habits like that, listing them off with a proprietary smirk. Another time, I was having a particularly stressful day at my tech job. I vented to Lisa about my boss, a man I called the Weasel, because of his shifty eyes. Later that week, Lisa casually mentioned the Weasel in conversation, using the exact nickname I'd only ever shared in private with Sarah. I pulled back, pressing her for details, but she just smiled. "Girlfriend intuition, maybe?" The real dread set in one rainy Tuesday night. We were relaxing on the couch when my phone, charging on the coffee table, suddenly vibrated. The screen lit up with an unknown caller ID. I normally ignore those, but this time, I felt compelled. I picked it up and answered. A wave of chilling static washed over the speaker, followed by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The sound was fleeting, but the voice, slow and thick with barely contained emotion, was unmistakable. "You can't hide from me, Mark." The sound was Sarah's voice, the one she used when she was on the verge of losing control, full of resentment and hurt. The line went dead immediately. I stared at the phone, my hand trembling. When I looked up, Lisa was no longer looking at the TV. She was looking straight at me, her expression unreadable. The light from the street lamp caught the side of her face, and for a split second, the beautiful, composed facade of Lisa flickered. The corners of her mouth stretched into a wide, icy smile, the same cold, victorious expression I'd seen on Sarah countless times right before she tightened her grip. It was gone instantly, replaced by a look of concerned curiosity. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice soft. I could only stammer. "Wrong number." But I knew the truth. It wasn't a wrong number. It wasn't a coincidence. The woman who had been declared gone was back, and she had somehow found a new way to wear her control. The smile, that brief, chilling victory flash that was so completely Sarah, was a match struck in the dark of my mind. It left me convinced that Lisa was merely a meticulously crafted shell, and the dangerous woman I had fled was piloting her from within. I couldn't accuse her. The look was gone in a blink, replaced by genuine concern. But I couldn't ignore it either. My suspicion grew into paranoia, and Lisa's actions only fed it. She began targeting my social circle. My best friend, Sam, a guy who usually met me for drinks every Friday without fail, started canceling. When I finally cornered him, he was distant, almost apologetic. Look, man, Lisa she gets me. She understands my job stress in a way you never did. We've been hanging out. The way he defended her was zealous, and the loyalty he once reserved for me had been effortlessly transferred to her. It was as if she had smoothly, quietly, cut my anchor lines to my closest support. Meanwhile, the strange details in my apartment escalated. I found a framed photo of my father, a picture I kept on my nightstand, had been turned face down. When I asked Lisa, she calmly said she must have knocked it while cleaning. But my father wasn't just a pleasant memory. Sarah hated him, seeing him as the root of my independence. It was a tiny, aggressive declaration of war against my past. Another time, taped to the underside of my favorite desk lamp, I found a small, intricate drawing. A symbol that was vaguely familiar, like a knot or a loop. It was disturbing, useless information that only she could have put there. I decided I needed proof, something concrete that tied Lisa to Sarah's life. I started tracing Lisa's origins, but I hit a brick wall. Her supposed previous city was a dead end. The company she claimed to work for had no record of an employee named Lisa. It was as if she had materialized out of the ether, exactly 6 months after Sarah vanished. The tension culminated during a dinner we had planned at a new, trendy downtown restaurant. Lisa insisted on driving. As she navigated the dense city traffic, she took an abrupt, unexpected turn onto a dark, cobbled side street. "Where are we going?" I asked, looking around nervously. Lisa gave a soft, familiar chuckle. "Don't you remember this place, Mark? It's perfect tonight." We pulled up to a dimly lit, slightly run-down Italian place. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been here in years. It was the Grotto, the tiny, obscure restaurant where Sarah and I had had our second date, the night she first pushed me to drop a friend she disliked. No one else knew about this place. It wasn't in any of my social media history. We sat down at a small table near the back. The air was thick with red sauce aroma and the memory of old arguments. Lisa looked right into my eyes, her new blonde hair catching the candlelight. But the look was Sarah's, intense, hungry. "Remember the story about the waiter and the corkscrew?" she asked, her voice low. "How he broke it right at this table? You got so angry?" I swallowed, the food turning to ash in my mouth. That was a memory shared only between Sarah and me, a forgotten, trivial detail. Lisa leaned in, and the polished veneer of her new persona finally cracked completely. Her voice dropped to the resonant, commanding tone Sarah used when she knew she had won. "You've been looking for me, haven't you, Mark? You think you escaped? But you and I are a story, and you can't end a story in the middle." She reached across the table, taking my hand in a grip that was surprisingly strong. "It was always going to be me. Always. You belong to me, Mark. And now that I'm back, you're going to remember exactly why." I looked at her face. The features were still Lisa's, refined and beautiful. But the dark, controlling shadow was unmistakable now, peering through the surface. She hadn't changed at all. She had simply disappeared to build a better cage. I was now absolutely certain I hadn't just gotten a new girlfriend. I had just been willingly absorbed back into her monstrous game. I sat across from her in the grotto, the air thick with garlic and the crushing weight of realization. It was Sarah. The woman who had obsessed over every breath I took was back. Only now she was disguised as Lisa, more patient, more manipulative, and infinitely more dangerous. My first thought was escape. I stood up, pushing the chair back with a scrape of wood on tile. "I'm leaving. This is insane." She didn't move. She simply picked up her wine glass, her eyes holding mine with a look of pitying disdain. "You're not leaving, Mark. You never could. Remember how I told you your life was just a very long story, and I hold the pen?" I knew any physical confrontation would be useless. Her control had always been psychological. I tried a different tack, grabbing the wine bottle. "What did you do? Where were you? You can't just reappear and expect me to..." "Expect you to love me?" she finished, smiling sadly. No. Expect you to submit. I had to disappear to understand how to truly rebuild you. That little symbol you found under your lamp? That was a reminder. A small piece of the lock. I returned to the apartment that night, not as a boyfriend, but as a spy in my own life. I began to search Lisa's things, desperate to find the key to her disguise, the source of her power. But her possessions were as blank as her past. Expensive, generic clothing, a phone with no contact list, and a pristine laptop. She had eliminated every thread that could connect Lisa to Sarah. The resistance was futile. Her control tightened like a noose. The next day, I was called into my office and fired. The weasel, my boss, looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Mark, look, someone sent me a stack of emails. Private stuff, sensitive projects, all your biggest grievances with the company. I can't keep you here." I knew instantly who had sent them. Only Sarah, in her controlling days, had accessed my private email, not to snoop, but to organize it. With my job gone and my best friend estranged, the social walls around me crumbled. I had nothing left but Lisa. She was right there to comfort me, to suggest we move in together, to propose that I stop worrying about a career and just focus on us. I accepted, because I had nothing left to say no with. The final scene of the surrender took place not in the dimly lit restaurant, but in Lisa's brand new, impeccably stylish apartment, a space entirely dictated by her taste, not mine. It was vast, quiet, and felt strangely watertight. I sat silently as she handed me a glass of aged whiskey. I noticed how my hands, once so restless, now lay placidly in my lap. I was tired of fighting. I was tired of suspecting. I was just tired. Lisa sat down next to me, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder. The contact sent no shiver of dread, only a settling calm. "See, Mark? Peace. You just had to stop fighting what's inevitable." I raised the glass and drank. It tasted like freedom, but I knew it was poison. I walked over to a full-length mirror, a magnificent gilded thing that reflected the luxury of her control. I looked at myself, and the man I saw was still me, Mark, mid-30s, defeated. I forced a smile, a genuine expression of acceptance. I had given up. But as I held the smile, I watched my own reflection. The smile lingered, not fading naturally, but growing wider, colder. The eyes in the glass were Mark's, but they held the unmistakable, hungry, victorious glint of Sarah. The reflection wasn't smiling at Lisa. It was smiling for Lisa. I hadn't broken free. I hadn't even found my prison. I had merely provided a more comfortable dwelling for her control. The smile softened again, returning to a simple look of tired acceptance. Did I finally find peace? I thought, looking around the controlled perfection of her apartment. Or was I now, finally, the perfect, permanent version of the man she had always intended me to be? The cold truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. Lisa was gone. Sarah had won. And now, she didn't need a phone or a lipstick message. She had the pen, and she had the main character. The story of my life was officially over, and her story had just begun.